Good morning, Mexico. Good afternoon, South Africa. Hello and welcome all to our roundtable, Socio-cultural Diversity, the Struggle for Nation and Citizenship in South Africa and Mexico, jointly organized by the Embassy of Mexico and the Institute for Global Dialogue. Para escuchar la interpretación simultánea de inglés a español, por favor elijan español en el botón de interpretación que tienen en la parte inferior de sus pantallas en el símbolo de mundo. To hear the simultaneous translation from Spanish to English, please press the interpretation button on the bottom of your screen and choose English. Thank you for being here with us this morning in Mexico City and afternoon in South Africa. My name is Nayeli Ceseña. I am the Cooperation, Culture, and Media Officer at the Embassy of Mexico in South Africa, and I will be your program director today. In this roundtable, we will learn and talk about the social cultural diversity in both Mexico and South Africa, which will contribute to a better understanding of our two countries. Allow me to give just a few house rules. All microphones and video connections will be closed to allow for better connectivity. After the presentations, we will have a Q&A session. Please write your questions in the chat box. I kindly request the speakers to keep track of their time in order to stay within the scheduled program. Thank you very much. And just a brief reminder that the bios of our speakers were shared attached to the invitation you received. Nonetheless, I would like to thank Professor Humberto González and Dr. Guillermo de la Peña for joining us from Mexico, as well as Professor Gretchen du Plessis from South Africa. Now, I am glad to give the floor to our first speaker, Her Excellency Sara Valdez Bolaño, Ambassador of Mexico to South Africa. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Nayeli. Muy buenas tardes, buenos días en México. Quisiera darles la bienvenida.
Thank you, Nayeli. Good morning in Mexico, good afternoon in South Africa. I would like to welcome you to this roundtable about Mexico and South Africa, jointly organized with the Institute for Global Dialogue. Based on the publication, Powers of the Global South, a comparative analysis between Mexico and South Africa, and under the topic of the first chapter, Socio-cultural diversity, the struggle for nation and citizenship in South Africa and Mexico. The authors of this chapter would present updated analysis about the socio-cultural diversity, in particular in terms of ethno-linguistics and its influence in the construction of the nations of Mexico and South Africa correspondingly. The topic is very important for our societies. Both of them are multi-ethnic and pluricultural, and they are nations where you can see differences and similarities. In the framework of the World Day for Cultural Diversity for Development that was celebrated on the 21st of May, this conversation has great relevance. I trust that these conversations will help new researchers and research institutes and education institutes in both countries will continue with this dialogue about the different aspects of the construction of our societies. I would like to thank especially Dr. Philani Ntembu, the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue of UNISA, and his team for being together with us in this reflection about our countries. I also like to thank the co-publishers of the book, Dr. Humberto González and Emeritus Professor John Hildenhuis, as well as the authors of the chapters that are going to be talking today. That's Professor Gretchen du Plessis and Dr. Humberto de la Peña. I would also like to thank the help of Dr. Arturo Mendoza Ramos, who is going to be moderating this session, and who is a specialist in linguistic matters. And he also knows very well both countries, and he will enrich in this conversation. I am sure that the exchanges of knowledge in this roundtable will be very fruitful and will help a lot our countries to come closer together, especially between the researchers, the research communities in Mexico and South Africa. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Our next speaker is Dr. Pilani Mtembu, Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue associated with UNISA. Please, Dr. Mtembu, go ahead.
Thank you very much, colleagues. And let me also extend that to Ambassador Sarah Valdez Bolaño, Ambassador of Mexico to South Africa. I think it's really great to see this conversation. I think this being the second part of a four-part dialogue and research series between the Institute for Global Dialogue and the Embassy of Mexico. I think it's very important because it puts a bridge between our respective societies and also does it in a way that also facilitates the exchange of information, including through your own language. And so I would like to really thank the team that has been at the forefront of putting these dialogues together from the side of the Institute for Global Dialogue with Ms. Susanna Caputi leading our team. And I'd really also like to thank the embassy for this. I think it's really an important dialogue. I mean, South Africa goes into its national elections on the 29th of May this year. And we have seen a process of nation building within South Africa. We've seen efforts to integrate, to be all inclusive, especially through the constitutional framework that was established, which accepts diversity, looks to thrive on diversity, and looks to use diversity as an asset in part of nation building. But 30 years into South Africa's democracy, it is quite clear that efforts of nation building are an ongoing work. And this is something that's carried out at multiple tracks of diplomacy, both at the level of the state, but also amongst the various political parties in parliament, and also non-state actors that play their role in the research area, in the dialogue area, at trying to find the commonalities that bind South African society 30 years into its democracy. Mexico attained its independence. It's been independent for much longer than South Africa has achieved its majority rule. But it becomes important amongst nation states and amongst peoples within the global south to have a discussion around their own journeys in terms of building a sense of nationhood, in terms of coping with diversity and efforts to build social cohesion within our respective societies. And what this is good as is that this is a conversation between South Africa and Mexico, but also a conversation between our respective regions. And so I would like to really say thank you to the authors that have been involved in this project for availing themselves and to the respective teams, and wish to just invite colleagues, irrespective of where you are located, to continue this dialogue between Mexico and South Africa moving on into the year. And with that, colleagues, I look forward to today's discussion. Thank you very much, facilitator.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Our moderator for today is Dr. Arturo Mendoza, Professor of Applied Linguistics. Please, Dr. Mendoza, the floor is yours.
Hola, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, muy buenos días en México, muy buenas tardes en Sudáfrica. Bienvenidos nuevamente a este webinario, diversidad.
Welcome to this seminario virtual, to this webinar, the struggle for citizenship and in Mexico and South Africa. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers of these webinars, in particular the Embassy of Mexico in South Africa, the Ambassador Sara Valdez Bolaño, Nayeli Ceseña Alvarez, the coordinator of the program. Nayeli is the officer of cooperation, culture, and media. Also to Susana Caputi, the senior associate researcher of the Institute of Global Dialogue, that is associated to the University of South Africa, and she is also the coordinator of this event. Thank you to Dr. Pilani Tembu, the executive director of the Institute of Global Dialogue in the University of South Africa. Thank you to the co-publishers of this book, Professor Dion Heldenhuist and Professor Humberto González. They are the people. They are who published this book, Global South Powers in Transition: a Comparative Analysis of Mexico and South Africa. And thank you very much to the authors and researchers who have written these chapters, Professor Humberto de la Peña and Regine Duplessis, who wrote the chapters of socio-cultural diversity in both countries. Thank you to everyone who is here today with us, and thanks to our interpreters. Our topic today is a fascinating topic because of many different reasons. South Africa and Mexico are countries that has lots in common and some differences as well. I would like to start with South Africa. South Africa has been known because of its cultural diversity and ethnic diversity, the nation of the rainbow, as the Archbishop Desmond Tutu has said. It's a country that has several ethnic groups, and in particular, Zulus, the Xhosa, some people of European descent, from Great Britain, from Netherlands, Indians, mestizos, or colored people, as they are known in South Africa, and other European descendants. This diversity is recognized in the Constitution as 11 official languages, and also the sign language. Among these languages, we have two European languages, and also 9 languages.
In fact, it's 4 languages: the Afrikaans, English, Zulu, Xhosa, are spoken by about 60% of the population in this country. When it comes to the apartheid, in 1944, and for the next 3 decades, this formed South Africa in a very significant way, with this interracial segregation. And then it moved to a very important change. And Nelson Mandela was the first Black African president. And this was the beginning of a new era of hope and reconciliation for the country. The Constitution of 1996 is one of the most progressive in the world, especially when it comes to race, gender, and sexual tendency. And the idea is to be able to promote the equality. And we can see that the implementation of this constitution has faced quite a number of difficulties. Besides apartheid, South Africa has really faced huge growth. Besides all the political progress that it has faced, it has also had to face some stumbling blocks when it comes to the nation itself and the people in the nation. Well, we need to mention about inequality in the distribution of the support and of the richness of the country, and we need to acknowledge that most of the population is still living in very precarious ways. The unemployment continues to be very high, more than 35%. And something that is very important to highlight is that it is the second country, or even the first one, depending on what statistics you're looking into, with regards to inequality. We talk about settlements known as townships, and it's been very disappointing to see that we have not been able to find another kind of impact on these townships. There is a really strong xenophobic tendencies, and especially when it comes to making a difference against Asians, and then like people from Zimbabwe and Nigerians that immigrate into South Africa. And it's very important that we actually tackle these differences that we face in the land. Despite all of these, South Africa has got a very active civil society, and we have quite a number of movements that are non-government, especially when it comes to human rights and looking for the equality that is needed in the land. And all of these movements have been very important to mobilize the society. Well, I'm not going to mention right now this social movement, but if we have the opportunity later on, I would like to be able to mention some of them. Now, when it comes to Mexico, we also have a struggle in finding equality in the society. When it comes to the nationals, we have quite a number of ethnic problems, especially when it comes to the language, indigenous languages. We have quite a number of indigenous groups like the Nahuas, Aztecas, and this is really part of our idiosincrasy as a nation. There is one language that is spoken mainly by most of the population, but we have 68 indigenous languages. Yet less than 6% of the population doesn't speaks one of these languages, and this number continues to decrease. Obviously, the Mexican Revolution was the one that brought about the new constitution and gave us the agrarian renovation. And then we were able to build up a program cemented in this reform. Vasconcelos was the one that promoted a public education that could be free for everybody, especially in the rural areas. And he had this idea of mixed people, and then he had this idea of this race that he wanted to actually unify. And he wanted to promote the indigenous societies within the Mexican idiosyncrasy. It's true that this initiative unified the country, and it really enriched the country when it came to the culture and language, indigenous languages, etc. But then it had the increase of racial struggle among the mixed people and the Mexican African people. We have quite a number of work still to be done. because these groups continue to be very invisible, and sadly to say that the indigenous rural areas are the ones that are most affected by poverty. In fact, and I think that it's very important to mention that now in 2019, about 4 or 5 years ago, that we included the recognition of some of the indigenous group as part of the Mexican community. Even though Mexico boasts about a very good economy, but this also brings social inequity, just as it happens in South Africa. When it comes to Mexico, just like in South Africa, besides these problems, there have been quite a number of social and human rights groups that are active in the social society, and they have a very crucial role to play in the equality and inclusion. These social movements have some of the similarities that South Africa and Mexico share, because we want to emphasize the rights that those most vulnerable have. I also would like to remind the other speakers and those who are participating that you stick to the time, and that the last 5 minutes of your presentation that you will be able to share with us some of the conclusions about the work you have been doing. And while Professor Dion Heldenhuis is not with us today, sadly, so I'm gonna let Professor Humberto Gonzalez, who's co-editor of this book, and he has been part of the university in the Netherlands. I am really happy to be able to take part on this event that you have put together, because it's exciting to talk about these projects that could become parallel projects. And I'm really grateful to the Institute of the Global Dialogue that has made this possible, and the organization that has taken place via Susana. Thank you so much. The book that we edited, that Professor Dion and I have edited, it started to highlight the differences that we could have had as Mexico and South Africa. But at the same time, we were sharing a very strong desire to do research. We were motivated to see the critics of the paradigm that different nations share when it comes to their historical narrative, especially when it was looked through the lenses of the North. We wanted to highlight the social cultural diversity, especially among those countries that have been labeled as emerging, because we wanted to see what alternatives they have available for them. And we wanted to see if there was a space or a forum to reconsider the agendas that they could share. So in a very comparative methodology, we made emphasis in 3 different areas with the people that took part of this comparative methodology to do exactly that, to compare both languages. We wanted to look at the historical, territorial aspects of each country and the deep influences that they had when it came to politics and social areas. And this is very important for us to know so that we could understand how they were able to do their transitions. We wanted to examine how the different differences could be carried out in the different contexts. We needed to understand the transitions that took place between Mexico and South Africa because problems shouldn't be taken into account in an isolated way. At the same time, we wanted to identify these processes of transition because in similar circumstances, the processes of change could actually be affected dramatically. So this is why we looked into the both transitions in a comparative way. And these provided us with very enriching perspective in this process that each country could contribute that would enhance our knowledge. And this comparison actually improved the different mechanisms of transition, and it also gave us an insight of the struggles that each country faced. The interest of our project was to be able to develop new hypotheses, especially when it came to the global context. We wanted to be able to reevaluate and then to be able to look into the priorities that South Africa and Mexico have. Through this comparative study, we wanted to be able to understand in more detail the different global dynamics with the local realities, offering some relevant perspectives, especially for those who are in charge of politics and social policies and for the nation in general. This comparative study between Mexico and South Africa was possible with the collaboration of those involved in Mexico and South Africa. One of the things that we realized it was the lack of familiarities in certain aspects with the different countries.
Al tiempo que reconocíamos que el conocimiento trasciende estas fronteras. Nos sorprendió darnos
We were struck by the realization that knowledge creation is inherently a collective endeavor, cultivated through a mix of conjecture and reflection within both physical and virtual spaces of communication. This process led us to recognize that global integration processes are neither driven by single causes nor follow universal trends. Instead, distinct historical processes became apparent that demanded detailed understanding for an accurate comparative analysis, discouraging any rush to simplistic conclusions. The ambitious goal of completing this book within 2 years proved unattainable. Our journey required breaking away from conventional academic practices and embracing periods of reflective silence. Our project anticipated the conditions that imposed on us COVID-19, as it proves that it is possible to establish a fruitful dialogue at and work in collaboration for 3 years with the technologies offered by the internet. In this period of time, we connected our theoretical musings with our empirical observations effectively. This experience highlighted the complex, nuanced nature of conducting comparative research across different cultural and historical landscapes. Please bear with me a second. As highlighted in the introduction, we define the concept of transition in a flexible and open-ended manner, enhancing its heuristic value. This perspective allowed us to explore the unique and varied processes of change without the constraints of conventional models focused on order, power, equilibrium, or growth. By avoiding these models, we steered clear of prematurely systematizing and comparing data to rank the countries on metrics like power, violence, efficiency, or growth. This methodological choice ensured a richer, more nuanced comparative analysis, avoiding oversimplifications and fostering a deeper understanding of each country's unique path and challenges. As we point out in the final reflections of our book, the historical trajectories of Mexico and South Africa were shaped by four crucial factors that have significantly influenced the social behavior and forms of economic, social, and cultural organization in both nations. First of all, it was the biodiversity and different forms of adaptation. Both nations are recognized as mega diverse by the World Conservation Center of the UN Environment Program. However, the rich biological diversity has historically degraded due to the intensification of economic activities aimed at fulfilling international market demands, often at the expense of environmental resilience. The detrimental impacts of such exploitation are particularly highlighted in discussions on mining and agribusiness practices, which we analyze in 2 chapters of the book. Second, the cultural, linguistic, and racial diversity, which we are talking about today. The exceptional diversity in both countries adds complexity to their social and political organization and affects their international relations. Recognizing and leveraging this sociocultural diversity enhances resilience and fosters more constructive and harmonious cooperation. Such recognition could also position Mexico and South Africa more favorably on the global stage, moving away from the inequalities and violence discussed in depth in our volume, in some particular chapters. Third, the colonial legacy and transition to independence. Both countries share a history of colonial domination, which has shaped their modern political and social landscapes. Mexico's colonization by Spain ended in the early 19th century, while South Africa's colonial period under European powers concluded with the establishment of the Union in 1910. The legacy of these periods continues to influence their contemporary transitions, which have been marked by efforts to redefine national identities and rectify historical injustices. 4. The post-independence governance and transition to democracy. This is another main topic, comparing these two nations. Following independence, both nations experienced periods of authoritarian rule that had to address internal disparities and manage complex international relations dominated by more powerful post-colonial states and transnational corporate interests. Recent decades have seen shifts towards more democratic and participatory governments, accompanied by economic adjustments aiming for global competitiveness and a stronger international influence. However, these transitions have been challenged both internally and externally by resistance to embracing ideological and cultural diversity. These four factors collectively underscore the unique yet comparably challenging paths of Mexico and South Africa as they navigate their identities and roles in a global context, striving towards societies characterized by social justice and inclusive dialogue. Today, we present Chapter 1 of the book entitled Socio-cultural Diversity, the Struggle for Nation and Citizenship in South Africa and Mexico. I want to point out that the structure of the chapters in the book is the result of careful deliberations among the editors, who concluded that the first chapter, authored by Guillermo de la Peña and Gretchen du Plessis, would be the ideal start. This chapter provides readers with a comprehensive historical perspective, covering the wide range of topics discussed in the book. It also exceptionally highlights the socio-cultural diversity of both countries and the ongoing struggle in the formation of the nation and citizenship. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Humberto González. And now I would like to open the mic to Dr. Humberto de la Peña, who is doctor in social anthropology from the University of Manchester in England. Doctor, you have the word. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me.
Perdón, doctor Mendoza.
Sí, no, que se escucha bien y se ve bien. Gracias.
Gracias.
We can hear you well and we can see you well.
Pues muchas gracias por la invitación a esta.
Thank you very much for the invitation to this virtual seminar. Thank you very much to the organizers, to the Mexican Embassy in South Africa, to the Ambassador Valdez, to Susana Caputi, to Nayeli Ceseña, and thank you very much to the coordinators of this book, to the publishers of this book. This is an exceptional book, an innovative book. It was really interesting to participate in the production of this book. And I think that it is very important to continue to think about it. My contribution to the book was about the diversity in Mexico and the fight for the nation, the struggle for the nation. It is accompanied in a very professional way by the other part of the chapter, produced by my colleague Gretchen du Plessis, who I am glad to greet now. I think one of the topics that you have already talked about, Dr. Mendoza and Dr. Humberto González, one of the subjects that they have said is the topic of the colonial situation of these two countries, which they don't only talk about the colonial period in the countries, but it talks also about the colonial situation that has been still there after the independence of the countries, and it has become, or it has transformed or mutated in other phenomena. And I would like to talk about how the colonial situation in Mexico has been changing, and it has taken different meanings in almost 4 centuries, almost four and even 5 centuries in our country. So the periods that I would like to consider are first the colonial period, that is from the 16th to the 19th century, the start of the 19th century. Then there is a period that we could call the first independence, that is the 19th century in particular. Then there is then there will be like a period that we could call the National Revolutionary period, and I think it will start with the Mexican Revolution, and it finishes in the last decades of the 20th century. And then we have a contemporary period that we are still trying to understand now. So colonialism in both countries, what it did was to connect those two countries with the world system, or the global system in the 16th century. So the integration to that world system, it was from a position of submission. So this is one of the main characteristics. They were subdued to that world system. So these were subdued countries that were colonized by other countries that were dominating them. So these colonizers were causing what was happening in the colonized countries. So one important characteristic was that they had to specify or identify or categorize the population in the country. There were many different categories to classify the population: legal, ethnic, and racial. For example, the legal categories were the population were classified in different sectors that have different rights and different situations under the law. So these different sectors were, for example, on top the Spaniards, and then the indigenous population. So as you may know, the word Indians was product of a mistake, from Cristobal Colón, who thought that he was arriving to India, and so the original population were starting to be called Indians.
So one way to unify them was through a very unequal distribution of territory and the richness. And especially because the territory was segregated and they were confined. I mean, the indigenous were confined and segregated to a piece of land, and the Spanish people had the possibility to inhabit the cities. On one hand, this was affected by the importing of the African slaves, because this created another category, where the Spanish people had one category, then the Aborigines had another one, and then they had the African slaves who actually didn't even fit into any of these categories. And then we talk about the racial mixture. And then in the 17th century, this new category of children and grandchildren of couples that were formed by Spanish males and indigenous females, and very rarely the other way around, So at the end of the colony, at the beginning of the 19th century, then Alexander Humboldt calculated that mixed population had increased to 27%. Yet the indigenous population was 55% and the white people were only 18 people. But by then, the African population was really insignificant. It had a very low percentage because slowly the situation of slavery started to decrease, and the slaves were released. They were set free and allowed them to emancipate. With the constitution in Cadiz in Spain that abolished slavery, and then with the independence of Mexico that abolished slavery completely. So this situation of segregation between the Indians and the Spanish, and now this new sector, which is very difficult to define. Now they're called the mixed race. There was between the Aborigines and Spanish people, and then the Africans. The African people. We had mixture everywhere. So the situation of mixed races started to grow, and these started to confine the other categories to sectors of minority, but experiencing growth. In fact, in the 19th century, there was a very formal speech that was being built up that mentioned that the indigenous population needed to disappear, not physically, but the idea was to abolish these legal differences so that they could start embracing these unification as a culture. And this was really inspired by the French Revolution. And the idea that the nation could be birthed out of the state. So there could be a national identity, that there could be one nation, one culture. In Mexico, they attempt to do this in a legal sense. And one of the things that they started to do was to abolish the corporations' rights, because the indigenous people did not have any rights in this sense. These corporative rights were the ones that were entangled with the individual's rights. So the idea of the liberal legislation in 1957 with the federal constitution that was head by the Liberal Party. So this Mexican legislation abolished all of these indigenous organizations, and that meant that they lost their land. Because the idea now was to convert this land into a corporative property. So a good part of the indigenous people were taken by the private sector. And there were people that used to enrich themselves through these lands because they use it for companies and not only for livestock. sadly, besides doing this equality through the legislation, did not apply when it came to the civil society. They were supposed not to be these categories anymore of the Spanish and the indigenous, but the indigenous sector were considered as an inferior class or sector. And the idea was for them to lose their quality of indigenous. So they needed to lose their identity as an indigenous group to be able to join now as a national. It's true that this mixed race was a fact during the time of the colony, but the different census were defining as mixed people 50% of the population. In fact, 50% of half of the population were considered mixed. And there were only left 17% of white people. So the advancement of the mixed race became an ideology as a nation. In the second half of the 20th century, through the work, through a book called Mexico Throughout the Centuries. And in this Mexican history, we used to talk about Mexico and the indigenous people as a glorious period, but then the mixed race came. But was confronted by this idealistic idea that now the progress could actually enhance the nation, and the indigenous people were left behind. So the Mexican government needed to enhance this class of the mixed people. Later on, the government that took power in Mexico after the revolution, there was a very vigorous movement of education, and it had the mixed race as the core, and they actually call it the cosmic race because they believed that this was the future of the nation. Because the idea was that these mixed race people were continue to mix themselves with others. And the idea was that they would enhance the building up of the nation and advancement of the nation. So now they were really targeting this mixed race idea to improve the socio-economic society. And they wanted to convert indigenous people to become nationals. And they started to talk about acculturization, which is a fusion of two or more cultures. So the schools made such an effort. The schools were the ones who had this vision to have one national culture, this acculturization, the integration and fusion of the indigenous to the normal population. Some of the very brilliant minds of the country took part on this idea together with government with intent However, they were not able to accomplish their goals despite the fact that the population that was considered indigenous and the acculturated mixed race was also increasing, because they continue to have this colonial kind of a mindset, which considering them below or less than others. So this colonial mindset continue to be in the background when it came to the philanthropic acts. So this finds a breakage at the end of the 20th century when we talk about the revolution that was creating in the country from decades before. And there is a very important component, which is very dynamic, which was the building up of the agrarian reform, agricultural reform. And this is very important for the topic that brings us together, because this agricultural reform meant that the rural indigenous people were able to be established, because the social property that were given to some of these people's group and now they decided to change the name of not mentioning now as indigenous groups, but actually as agricultural groups. So then we were talking about the growth, about agricultural groups that were growing within the land. So now these people's group started to receive the benefits of education. And the agrarian reform starts to face a crisis in 1970, because the land that was available to be distributed was actually coming to an end.
This means that a part of the rural population that didn't have access to land started to migrate to the city or to the United States. There is a new population group that it is in poor conditions in the cities, and this is like a sub-proletariat, urban sub-proletariat formed by many migrants from rural or indigenous communities. What happens here is that there is people who is not happy with what is going on, and so there are new narratives and new ideas against the indigenous policy. And there's many intellectuals that start talking against this policy. And in the 90s is the start of an armed movement in the south of Mexico, in the southeast of Mexico, in the state of Chiapas. And this movement is called an army, like a Zapatista army of national liberation. And the Zapatista was a movement that started in the Mexican Revolution in 1910, And so this indigenous movement in 1994 takes the name of the Zapatista movement, meaning that they are looking for equality and citizenship. So the term citizenship, civil society, democracy start to become very important, because at that time democracy in Mexico was nothing really. It was only a word, but it has no real meaning. So this took us to some reforms in Mexico. Even before the Zapatista movement, there was a change in the Mexican Constitution. One of the articles, one of the sections of the Mexican Constitution was changed in order to acknowledge the existence of cultural diversity in Mexico, and a plurination. This happens in 1992, and it was the first time that the word indigenous people, was included in an official document of the Mexican Republic. So this change in the Article 4 of the Mexican Constitution acknowledge the existence of the indigenous population, and acknowledge the right of this group to be indigenous, and not to be acculturated or assimilated to the main Mexican idea, in order to be recognized as plain and real Mexicans. There are many consequences of the Zapatista movements, for example, in 2001, and there is a stronger legal or legal field, or where legal body, where you start to have a new idea of citizenship with the rights of the indigenous population. Just before I finish, I would also like to talk about the Afro-descendant population. In the case of Mexico, it was abandoned for a very long time, not just by Mexican politics, but even for the census, the population census in Mexico. Even in 1988, the main census, or the count, is not really a census; it's a count of population in that date. It was done by a geographer, Antonio Garcia Cubas, and in that count or census, it said that there was no Black population or Afro-descendant population in Mexico. It was they were all mestizo or mixed race. It was true that in the 19th century, most of the Afro-descendant population started to integrate to the mestizo population, to the mixed race population, because the Afro-descendant, they didn't have restrictions of movement during the colonial period, so they started to come to parts of the economic activity where they needed labor. For example, in mines, in construction, in services, in the cities, Afro-descendant people come to these activities, and it started to grow during the 19th century. So the Afro-descendant population start to be they are not visible during that time in the population, but there are still some groups, some more specific groups of Afro-descendant population in regions, in particular geographical regions, where there were more mines or some activities, in specific in the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast. And in those regions and in those communities, there is a different identity, or a different communities. They don't think of themselves as indigenous or something else. They consider themselves Afro-descendant or Black communities. And they only said, they call themselves Black or Moreno. That is a term that is used for that in Guerrero, for example. And as Dr. Mendoza has said, it is until 2009 that that it is in 2019 in the Constitution, there is a recognition and acknowledge of the African descendant population in the Constitution. Now I would like to talk about how a new idea of citizenship is being constructed in Mexico. This idea has as the main or central notion the idea of plurality. Some scholars have talked about this idea of citizenship as ethnic citizenship, and it has four components or four parts. The first of them is the citizen right to a dignified visibility. That means that the indigenous population and the Afro-descendant population, they shouldn't be seen as something different or strange, and that they need to have the right to express themselves through their clothes, through their language, through their costumes, through their traditions, to express their condition, their culture, their ethnicity, without it being a stigma. So, for example, nowadays, if an indigenous person from the community, the Huitzarica or Huichol community, if he comes to a public space, people might think of their clothes as something pretty but strange. So the idea here is to start creating a mindset that normalizes the fact of being different, of being culturally different. The second aspect is the right to reproduce the cultural difference. For this, it is very important, the educational policy. This means that the indigenous languages could be used as public languages. That means that in schools, they might be used. They are accepted. They will be accepted in schools, in the use in school. Since 2005, we have a general law, a general act of linguistic policy, which acknowledges all the indigenous languages as national languages. This means that that Spanish or Castellano is not the only national language. When I studied my elementary education, Spanish or Castellano, the subject in the school was called national language. Well, the idea is that the languages of the cultural community, of the indigenous communities, should be respected, and all their rights, linguistic rights, should be respected. That means that the members of those groups should have respected their language in reproducing it, in transmitting it. This doesn't mean that the languages need to be protected in a way that they don't change, because that's not the nature of language. Language is changing constantly. But one thing is for languages, for cultures to be changing, because its members are adapting to circumstances, and something very different is to have a forced change, for the context to force changes in those cultures and languages. This is the right to conservation and reproduction of the language and culture. The third aspect is the right to control the resources in order for their culture to reproduce and transmit. This has a lot to do, in the case of rural areas, with the land. We need to acknowledge currently that in current times, at least half of the indigenous population, or the people who think of themselves as indigenous people, that is 25 million of people. This is not people who speak indigenous languages. According to the census, to the population census, it says that there are only 7 million of people speaking indigenous languages. But there is another question in the census where they ask if to people if they identified with an indigenous community. And in that case, 25 million people answered that they identified as indigenous. Part of that group of people don't necessarily live in rural areas. They might live in cities, or they might be immigrants coming and going to the United States. So nowadays is the world of the indigenous cultures is very complex. So what are the kind of resources that this population needs? Considering that they are not attached now necessarily to a land, they need, there is a challenge to recognize the resources that they need. This is a challenge to anthropologists, to legislators, to politics. It's an open question. And the fourth component of this ethnic citizenship is the right to political autonomy. This has two different sides. The first, the right to government and an own legal system. And the second one is the representation, the political representation to the state and the national. This is a right that is already acknowledged in the municipal level. So indigenous communities can send representatives to the town halls or to the municipality, but this is not recognized in urban councils, or in the case of cities, and it is of course not acknowledged in the Congress of the Union, in the National Congress. That is, except for some quotas, some that are inside the political parties, but they are not really respected. So these rights that we are talking about, the right to representation of the indigenous population, are still a very big challenge. Furthermore, we cannot say that the indigenous world is perfect, or that we need to promote everything that is done in the indigenous world. But that happens the same with the mestizo world or any kind of community. And no culture is worse than any other, but all cultures could be improved. All of them have negative and positive. They can learn. We can learn from them, and they can learn from us.
So a very great challenge that we have is to be able to consolidate a country that is not only culturally plural, but a citizenship that is differentiated, while at the same time can enjoy equality. And I think that it sounds like a paradox, but it's important, and I think it's necessary and possible. And I apologize if I took extra time. He has studies on anthropology. And now I'm going to give the floor to Professor Gretchen Duplessis. She's got a PhD in sociology and lecturer in the Department of Development Studies at the University of South Africa.
Good afternoon from South Africa, Madam Ambassador, Madam program director, colleagues, thank you for this opportunity to share with you our experiences from this book and from my perspective as one of the co-authors. It's a real privilege. Thank you. I hope to keep to my time. Let's see. So our specific contribution was on socio-cultural diversity, the struggle for nation and citizenship. And I just want to say at the start of my presentation that I'm not repeating the chapter. Instead, what I'm doing in my presentation is to reflect on what I call 5 key moments in the chapter and then suggest a way forward. And the 5 key moments that I wish to reflect on is, first of all, the idea of the Rainbow Nation dream. Then I'm going to reflect on the long shadows of the past. I'm going to quickly look at middle class formation and transformation. That's going to bring us to a contemplation of who are the poor today in South Africa. And then we're going to look at a context that has multiple crises and have multipolarity in terms of political and economic influence. So the first point is that I want to look at the issue of the fact that for both the countries, a vibrant pride in our respective indigenous past invigorated our democratic transitions. South Africa's democratization was intended to ensure peace, equality, oneness, human rights. And that Rainbow Nation dream was intended to harmonize South Africans and to validate the reconciliation. Yet what did we see? 3 waves of xenophobic violence in 2008, 2015 and 2019, and these started to extinguish the bright flames of the dream of a fully inclusive society in South Africa. South Africa was saved and might continue to be saved from complete fragmentation via its liberal constitution and its open national economy. Yet what do we see? Enduring apartheid remnants, such as racial stereotypes and inequalities. Most telling is the sorry state of land reforms that have largely failed to restructure agrarian relations in favor of the landless poor. And as we argued in the chapter, to prevent multiculturalism from becoming little more than an empty signifier that acts as a type of social glue to keep people together, South Africa should actively seek ways to create a space for social justice and equality by drawing on the vestiges of legitimized collective action and deeply embedded comradeship. My second point is to look at the fact that, historically speaking, colonial underdevelopment, Western capitalism, European modernity, and African tribalism coexisted in a mutually constituting relationship in South Africa, leading to very specific ethno-racial demarcated class formations. And in the chapter, we already touch on the issue that some momentum was created by the March 2015 student protests. Some of you might know it as the Fallist movements in South Africa. And as academics It excited us as a way to renew efforts at curriculum transformation, chiefly through the ideas of decolonial research and theory. And this was to be a social justice project. It soon ran into the barriers created by curriculum theory gatekeeping in South Africa. Now, many of the South African decolonialists also tried to adapt a very Latin American decolonial theoretical framework, and they found that this theory did not travel well to Africa because a lot of this argued from an understanding of colonial assimilation, and that ill-matched the experience of colonialism as enforced difference. Decolonial theorizing took hold in some of our higher education institutions, and for many of us it was an exciting moment, and it created a fertile ground for very active academic debates. Many publications stem from it. We built networks and summer schools and so on. But as that political project to drive transformation inside our higher education institutions, these efforts were constrained by scandals that beset many of our institutions, by the disruptions, especially those caused by the lockdowns of COVID-19, and NEFSA's funding difficulties, that is the South African funding organizations to fund students. So actual institutional transformation, where these exciting theoretical visions of an Afrocentric decoloniality is translated into actual political projects, is currently still a bit muted, although a lot of excitement still resides in that space. So then we can talk about middle class formation and transformation. And in this regard, access to service delivery and livelihood strategies is constrained by the inability of our institutions to deliver effectively. And this in turn has negatively affected the state-society relations or the social contract and the legitimacy of the reconciliation agenda. Business Tech in 2016 said that the South African middle class is about 15% of the population, that it is diverse, but that it's also not representative of the majority experience. Middle class and political elite formations beyond ethno-racial categories are visible in our society. However, back in 2015 already, Melba concludes that they are unlikely to become a force for redistributive transformation and for the social inclusion of the poor. Many upwardly mobile persons navigate that wicked maze of hypercapitalism or hyperconsumerism and are in danger of succumbing to the flatteries gained by serving power or me serving through the end of a selfie stick, endless TikTok marketing or social influencing, and other social media traps. The social world remains full of hierarchical divisions, with the idea of a common, totally inclusive humanity not being put into practice. Marginalization, structural destitution at the local level intersect with global accumulation and exclusion. Multiple forms of insecurity at the level of health, food, economic, environmental, water, and livelihood insecurity still persists. We are at what is called the Hirschman cycle. That means that it is like two oncoming lanes of traffic in a tunnel. And us waiting for my turn, for many people, is causing a feeling of despair and anger. Anne-Marie explains it like this. He says, perhaps the most galling has been the sense of rampant unfairness, that the fruits of liberation are not being distributed fairly. Not only does daily life reiterate the scandal of inequality, but rightful access to elementary sources of well-being too often seem to require connections, payoffs, and favor. Who are the poor? If we speak of a truly inclusive society, then our expectation would be that interracial and intraracial poverty should be reduced. But this is proving slow to change. 9 out of 10 poor people are Black, and Black women are more likely to be poor than any other category of persons in South Africa, according to Stats SA in 2015. The intersecting marginalization forces of race, class, and gender signifies to us that redress, equality, dignity, and justice, as promised in the Constitution and in the Rainbow Nation dream, are still lagging behind. The poorest of the poor remain predominantly Black South Africans. The state's delivery models have led to inadequate service provision, and subsidies and grants are channeled through mechanisms that are fraught with injustice and malpractice. Land redistribution and the nationalization of mines have not been fully addressed. Todes sees these problems as the continuing of the ghettoization of the poor in unworkable, dysfunctional urban settlements. South Africa's economic growth slowed down to 0.6% in 2023. And it was undermined by poor public service delivery, especially in electricity supply, in water and sanitation, in transport and logistics, and in public safety. Per capita income contracted by 0.4%, and the unemployment rate remains above 30%. As of 2023, 18.2 million people in South Africa are living in extreme poverty. The Gini coefficient rose from 59 in 1993 to a staggering 63 in 2015, which is the most recent estimate of inequality. We often see the youth as presenting a so-called demographic dividend. That means there is a large cohort of young people entering our population, and usually in many countries that meant that there is an infusion of people ready to go into jobs and earn a salary or create new ideas and drive innovation and economy. And because of this understanding, us who are in universities would know that the whole idea of entrepreneurship is touted as very important. We've got entrepreneurship training, design thinking training, and yet, is it fair to ask of our youth to now create the jobs that are lost, to create the wealth that is lost. So, continued in this is to look at the broken social contract. At the start, I said that was all about the social contract. And there are three elements in a resilient national social contract, the contract between the state and its people. The first is we need flexible and increasingly inclusive and responsive attendance to the pain points or to the crisis moments of development. The second one is that social contract needs to evolve strong institutions that can deliver services that meet expectations and consolidate state legitimacy. And the third one is we need to find ways to address both vertical and horizontal inequalities and to forge some kind of social cohesion effectively and accountably. And if we think about it, one of the most striking issues in service delivery is that of water and sanitation. Although the percentage of households connected to sanitation services has improved since 2014, 3.8 million households in formal residential areas have unsafe sanitation. Access to toilets is a matter of dignity and it's a matter of health. And if we see what has been happening in our news, we find the example of the so-called toilet wars in Cape Town. More recently, there were protests by the residents of the Gate 7 informal settlement who have lived in that area for 15 years without having access to toilets. KwaZulu-Natal beaches and lagoons are polluted with effluent due to sewage spills, broken sewage treatment facilities, and the impact of severe flooding. Where do we find ourselves in this context? Where is our context at? And I say it's a context with many crises and with multiple polarity. We face a polycrisis world after the devastation of COVID-19, which we couldn't even foresee when we started off with our chapters. But if we hope that COVID-19 would see ourselves as a collective humanity enmeshed in the same virus risk, and that would reinvigorate healing interpersonal relations that were fractured before, then the reality is really sobering. We see interpersonal violence, particularly gender-based violence, increasing. Livelihood creation faces the ever-present threat of the effects of climate change on human health and food security. When we look at labor, we throw around the idea of flexible capitalism or increased ethno and androcentric precarity of labor. The COVID lockdowns threw flexible labor arrangements into a new relief for us. However, the negative externalities of labor precarity exacerbated acute forms of inequality and exploitative, insecure labor, incessant work, and digital Taylorism. Precarity and increased labor flexibility equalize or is equal to a kind of institutionalized uncertainty where employers have increased control over their workers, especially in the form of excessive digitized surveillance and performance audits. And disaffected workers under these precarious labor situations often look for scapegoats that are even more marginal than themselves to blame for their situation. For example, migrants. Now, this gap between the micro practices of dehumanization and the macro politics that enable it are negligible. And the reason why I argue this is that moving certain categories of people based on gender, race, ethnicity, language, outside the ambit of what it means to be the human inside human security discourses is the foundation of a genocidal logic. As we sit here tonight, we see actual wars and human atrocities occurring in front of our eyes. The genocidal logic that is unfolding in such a graphic and dramatic fashion is but part of a continuum of the logic of death that finds expression in small ways, in microaggressions, and in grand ways, in small and big gestures in our society. We, as we sit here, all bear witness to grotesque dehumanization and the erasures of people. Alliances have shifted in multipolar ways. The BRICS of today is an entirely different animal from what it used to be. However, it still has no statute or secretariat, although the chairpersonship shifted from SA to Russia in 2023-24. BRICS de-dollarization efforts are diluted by the fact that some BRIC members have a close relationship with the US and that many still hold substantial amounts of US dollars assets in their reserves. I've painted a very bleak picture. Where does hope reside? Hope resides in the fact that we can look to Alice Walker, who said to us that hard times require furious dancing. So as we reflect on our past and where we would like to be, we claim our past, but we also claim our future. For us here, as academics, as engaged or activist scholar researchers, as human beings, as parents, as people who influence one another, we need to consciously, mindfully lead one another each day into a conception of solidarity that hinges on radical differences and that insists on relationships of incommensurable interdependency. So as we are different, we are also dependent on one another. We need to actually go and actively encourage socio-political justice praxis in our own research, in the research that we supervise and encourage amongst our students. For example, the whole debate around food systems and moving the outdated food security debate to a debate of actual food sovereignty. We cannot own up to being destructive species once it is too late. And in that regard, my plea is for protecting our environment, for environmental security, along with all the other things that we need to look at. And I also think we need to be far more cautious and conscientious about an AI-led world. in summary, what do I feel we've learned? I think that we've learned that collaboration between two countries is a joyful, a challenging, but highly creative endeavor. We've learned that our editors were exceptional human beings who did the actual border crossing work. They crossed over countries, we crossed over language barriers, we crossed over disciplines. Maybe a second edition is calling to us. And then finally, we've learned that a comparison between the two countries shows that the twin issues of rising inequality and institutions that find their legitimacy increasingly being questioned are common crises for multicultural democracies. And that is the end of my presentation. Best wishes from a very cold Tswane today. Thank you for your time.
Muchísimas gracias a la profesora Gretchen Duplessis. Vamos ahora.
Thank you very much to Professor Gretchen Duplessis. We are now going to do a question and answers section. I'm not sure if there is a question or a comment that you would like to do to the participants. If you would like to use at the bottom of raise your hand or to ask a question, or maybe in the chat box we might have a question. Let me see. I'm going to look at the chat box to see if we have. I think we have two different comments in the chat, Arturo. Yes, I can see them now. So we have one comment here. I'm going to read it. It's in Spanish, so I'm going to read it. The vindication of the indigenous of ethnics in South Africa have similarities. First of all, they are communal or collective. When they are individual, there has been a loss of dignity of migration and urbanization. And taking this in mind, I would like to ask if you think that the differences between the communities indigenous communities in Mexico and the tribal communities in South Africa have a specific weight in your research. I think that in the international law there is no weight of that. They mentioned the Convention 169 of the ILO, International Labor Organization, and the Convention of Indigenous Communities, and also they are asking if you can give your opinion about the traditional knowledge of indigenous and tribal communities, if they can contribute to the challenges of the environment, meaning the desertification or from desertification to climate change. Professor Gretchen Duplessis, Professor Guillermo de la Peña, I don't know if you would like to say something about this.
No sé si se me escucha.
I don't know if you can hear me. Yes, your camera is a little bit too low, and we were not able to see you properly. Thank you so much. That's perfect. I am not sure if I understood correctly the first part of the question. If you consider that the differences between the chapter that we wrote together with Professor Gretel, that we wrote together, actually we did not tap into this in the chapter, and it will be very interesting to see if this has to do with new reforms and especially looking into the declaration that United Nations did regarding the indigenous groups. Because the Mexican and South African ethnic groups could lead us to very different, to huge differences in the legislation. Because the truth is that there is not a great acknowledgement regarding the territories of the indigenous people. And when it comes to the contributions that these people can do regarding the environment issues, I think that my answer will be yes. I think that when I mentioned about the third right, that the indigenous ethnic groups, which is the control over the resources, we need to mention about the consultation that we can highlight, because there are some projects that are private, and the truth, these projects sometimes can have a very harming effect on the land. And according to the legislation, before starting any public project, is that they need to be consulted before running ahead with this project. And when it comes to this consultation, it is implied to take into account the knowledge these people's groups have with regards to their own environment. So this is why we need to ask them freely and well-informed their opinion and their insight. But the truth of the matter is that this has not been respected. And on the contrary, the Maya jungle has been destroyed, for instance. And they approach this in a very inappropriate way. And the UN established that the people's groups, ethnic people's groups, were not consulted prior to destroying this jungle, this forest. And they continue to do this when they plan some projects and they do not take into account these ethnic groups that inhabit the land. So the first thing that we need to do is to acknowledge them. And one way of acknowledging them is actually to consult them. Thank you so much. Professor Gretcher, do you have any comment to make? Would you like to make any comment?
No, not at this stage. Thank you.
Sorry. We also have another comment. I'm going to read it.
South African dispensation is that the Black South African political elite partners the white monopoly state and white institutions that support and protect it have long reduced the South African Black struggle of that for civil liberties and citizen rights. As such issues of toilets matter, of dignity and health, etc., has being the most important issues affecting Blacks. The solution is service delivery, which would heal fractured relation, bringing in social cohesion. And then it says South Africa is not a nation state social cohesion, and it will not form a nation or a nation state. The country has to be decolonized. That means undoing its settler colonial makeup failing the Black South Africans will be subjects of white philanthropy. Bueno, es un comentario específicamente relacionado con la situación en Sudáfrica. No sé si hay algún comentario a este comentario, sobre todo de la parte sudafricana. Ok, déjenme ver si tenemos entonces aquí algo más. Bueno, tenemos también otro comentario, denme un momento, es que leerlos aquí en el chat me cuesta un poco de trabajo. Tenemos otro comentario, dice, on the question of...
We have another comment.
Dice, on the question of South Africa and xenophobia, what do we make of what we learned from the recent George building collapse? Are the complaints from poor, mainly Black South Africans not legitimate insofar as wanting the enforcement of South Africa labor laws that set certain parameters for labor recruitment? Are we not oversimplifying the concept of xenophobia in the South African context? That's a question. And then, are the poor and working class locals not generally labeled as lazy and pushed away labeled as lazy and pushed away from employment opportunities for reasons of capitalist exploitation? Entonces aquí hay dos preguntas. No sé si Gretchen, profesor Gretchen, quiera comentar algo sobre el comentario anterior y esta pregunta.
I don't know if there is anybody who would like to make a comment regarding these two comments that I have just read.
Okay, bueno, tenemos también otro comentario.
Okay, we have another comment. It says a very good research. Congratulations. I would like to know if your research about these two groups are the most excluded ones, the indigenous people and the tribal peoples group. And among the tribal groups and indigenous, what about the female gender? Says I don't really understand very well the comment because it looks like they did not finish a comment. But I will continue reading what it says. If your research opens a gap not only academic but also social for the acknowledgement of the social rights or citizenship rights, or maybe it's just a proposal that can help recover the wisdom of these people, or a social way that will be more humane. Go ahead. Well, I think that the topic about the rights of females among the indigenous groups, it has been researched. And within these indigenous groups, there have been women who have become activists with regards to this topic. Obviously, there is a lot of prejudice and false ideas that speak about the selling of indigenous girls and forced marriages, polygamy, legal polygamy. But most of these accusations are actually false, because most of the cases that have been spoken about have not been proven. And the truth is that there is such a patriarchal system, which is very strong, but you can also find it in non-indigenous groups. Actually, you can notice it much more in this indigenous group, this patriarchal system. About 23 years ago, when it came to the National Congress in the city of Mexico, there were representatives of the indigenous groups. One of the speakers was an indigenous one of the south of Jalisco, from the south of Jalisco, Maria de Jesus Patricio, who spoke about the triple liberation of these women when it came to indigenous, then working and being women, to have more equality between men and women. And I think that this is an effort that is being made in the entire nation. In Mexico, there is a very strong feminist advancement at this moment. That has been manifested in many different ways. It has been manifested in the city of Mexico and in other cities as well, and in very important zones or areas. The demands that the feminist group has when it comes to maternity, marriage, the reproduction rights, working rights, to be visible in a dignified way, and advancement. This is a task that all the Mexicans have, not only the indigenous group. And I think that it's very important to support this group. And at the end, this question or this comment makes will be a proposal for a proposal that can help recover the wisdom of these people for a social way that could be more humane. I think that we need to talk about the National Congress and the different movements, that they can provide different ways to appreciate and take into account the vision that indigenous groups have with regards to the future, the environmental and social future. And I think that we have a very long way to still walk. Thank you so much, Dr. Guillermo de la Peña. We don't have much more time left. We have come to an end, and I just would like to say and conclude, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to I'm not going to be able to tap into the thumb up, but I really want to say thank you for all the contributions that Professor Guillermo and Gretchen Duplessis did, and also to highlight the need for the research of these kind of topics. And I think that these topics of comparison can really, truly help to the knowledge of one another, but they can also provide us with a bigger spectrum of what is going on in our own localities. Probably the book does not have many years of being published, but it is good to have more research and or, to gather the material, actually, it takes a very long time. But thank you so much to everybody who participated in the putting together of this book. And I really would like to encourage to continue doing research with this comparative kind of methodology. And I think that one of the things I discovered while being in South Africa is this big network that has been established that before we didn't have. Like, for instance, to talk about the wanted ones and the unwanted ones, to take them into consideration, and also to have this opportunity to collaborate together, even though when it comes to demographic distances, we're very far away from one another, but where we share similarities and the way, and we share the way in which the two countries have been approaching the difficulties they face daily. And I think that this research that uses this comparative methodology, it will continue to provide us with these collaboration platforms. And I would like to tap back into what Professor Guillermo mentioned, is that when it comes to citizenship, we need to talk about the plurality, but also the unification, the unity. As Mexicans, we face, and I think that is something that I have faced, especially in South Africa, when we have a society that has multi-ethnicity and multi-languages, is the idea of how can we actually make sure that the community comes together while keeping their diversity. And I think that Guillermo de la Peña mentioned the linguistic side, because these culture and linguistics play a very important role. Especially South Africa makes quite a number of efforts to include the learning of these languages, these native languages or dialects. And it has included them in the primary education system. So the idea is to think how we can continue including in the higher education, so it can also have a component of not only learning the language, but also to learn the context embedded within the language. And especially when we need to take into consideration all the ethnic groups that we have, and we need to learn their cultures and languages, that has and could be included in the primary school, and it's progress to acknowledge this area. And well, this is all, and thank you so much to everybody who participated. Dr. González, Dr. de la Peña, and Professor Duplessis, thank you so much for your presentations and your contributions. And I think that it was a really good time in the webinar. And I'm gonna give the floor now to Nayeli Cesena to give us the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this evening in South Africa and this morning in Mexico. I truly believe that this has been an enlightening exchange of visions, and the information shared by our speakers, I think that surely contributes to the study and analysis of different aspects of both our countries. Lastly, please bear in mind that the recording of this roundtable will be soon available on the Institute for Global Dialogue YouTube channel shortly. And the only thing that I have pending to say is thank you to all of you. Thank you very much, speakers. Thank you, moderator. Thank you, interpreters. Thank you, Susana Caputi from the Institute for Global Dialogue for co-organizing this event with us. And thank you all for joining us today. Please enjoy the day further on. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Nayeli.
Thank you all.